Hello and welcome. My name is Anthony Zalak, and I am the chairman of the 10 Mile River Scout Museum. And I am the secretary of the 10 Mile River Scout Museum, which is located in the headquarters area of the 10 Mile River Scout Camps in Narrowsburg, New York. The museum is hosting a series of informative talks which will hopefully be of interest to the general public, as well as to the scouts and scout leaders. Owing to the terrible pandemic we are all living through at this time, our series of talks is being given virtually, and we are thrilled that you have signed up and are here with us now. The 10 Mile River Scout Camps is located on a 12,000-acre reservation. Camps first opened in 1927, and the reservation was made possible by prominent New Yorkers led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The TMR Scout Museum was started in 1997 and is dedicated to preserving the history and artifacts of the 10 Mile River Scout Camps and the local area. The museum is currently closed due to COVID-19. You can take a virtual tour at www.museum.org/historian, or if you have any questions, you can call us at 845-252-2063. The virtual talk is being presented on the GoToWebinar platform. You will notice that you can use the questions feature. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the question box, and our presenter will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. Please take the brief survey after our talk. A video of this program will also be available on our YouTube channel. Tonight's talk is over. I will let you know about upcoming talks. Our plan is to present one talk every week or so, and the talks will be either at this time on a Tuesday or Thursday evening. You will find more information about our virtual talks and about the 10 Mile River Scout Museum at our website, our Facebook page, Twitter, and YouTube, which I have posted now. You can also call the museum at 845-252-2063 or email us at questions@tmrmuseum.org, or you can email our chairman, Michael Drillinger, at chairman@10milerivermuseum.org. Finally, the TMR Scout Museum is all volunteer-run except for our summer staff, who do get a small stipend. These virtual talks do incur some fee from the GoToWebinar. We have set up a special donation page if you are so inclined to support these talks and other museum programs. So our presenter tonight is Glenn Pontier. Glenn is the museum co-director and a longtime resident of Sullivan-Catskills region. He was born in Kingston, the terminus of the Delaware and Hudson Canal, and he has many local credits. He's the former editor of the River Reporter. He also served as the executive director of the Sullivan Renaissance and was the public information officer for Sullivan County. Please welcome Glenn Pontier. Glenn, you're on mute.
Hey, listen, I want to thank the museum for this opportunity to talk a little bit about the area that I love. And I'm going to show my screen here so everybody can follow along. And we're really going to talk about the area. Many of you live in this area. Others of you come to visit this area because it's wilderness. But it wasn't always so. There was a time in our country's development when this area contributed more to the industrial development of our country than any other area of our nation at that time. And it's a strange story. It's a true story, and it has to do with the bridge that many of you ride over. We know it as the Roebling Bridge, but it was built as an aqueduct to carry water through a canal, through the DNH Canal. So we're going to talk about that canal. This is it's almost hard to believe, but so let me start. I'm going to take this slow and not get into all of the details. But back in the early part of the 1800s, the coal for New York City came from England. And during the War of 1812, there was a shortage of coal because obviously the British were not sending coal to New York City or anywhere else. And so Philadelphia began to use coal from the Lehigh Valley. But New York City didn't have a supply of coal, and it inhibited the growth of the city. And there were three brothers named Wirtz, and we'll talk a little bit more about them, who developed a scheme to supply coal to New York City. And they had been exploring in Pennsylvania, and as you'll see on the map over on the left, in the Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Carbondale area, they're great coal fields. And they thought, well, let's move that coal to New York City. How would we do that? So using a series of what are called gravity railroads, which were railroads that had tracks and cars, but no engines. And they used gravity up a hill and down a hill to move the coal to a port in Honesdale. And then from Honesdale all the way to the Hudson River, they built a canal. Now, this canal was 108 miles long, and it's not level. Any of you who've driven up the Wurtsboro Hill know that, we live in the mountains or the foothills of the Catskill Mountains. And so the height of the canal needed to change. So they had to put locks at various places to raise and lower the barges that transported the coal. And they ended up with 108 locks. Now, this canal was an engineering marvel of the time. It was built in 2 or 3 years. They raised money in the beginning of the 1820s. They raised $1 million, actually $1.5 million. It was the largest privately capitalized project in American history at the time. And they sold out in one day, raising $1 million, which back then was a lot of money. And they hired the engineer that had built the Erie Canal, and he and his assistant, a man named Jervis, came and figured out how to design the canal. We're gonna talk about the different pieces of it, but this is another map because remember, we're talking about a system of delivering coal through barges. And if you see this map, you'll see on the upper left is a place called Honesdale. Many of you might have been to Honesdale. There are still some of the remnants of the canal works in Honesdale. And the canal came down following the Lackawaxen River all the way to the Delaware River. And then they would lower the barges into the river, cross to the other side, raise them back up in the canal, and they would run down along what is now Route 97 to Port Jervis. And at Port Jervis, they went up following the route of Route 209, all the way to Ellenville up to Kingston. Route 209 follows the old mine road, which was the oldest road in America, and it was used to transport copper and other minerals from New Jersey uh, uh, into New York State. If you look at the bottom of this map, you'll see the profile of the canal, which shows the height. And all the way on the left is Honesdale, and you see how high it is. All the way on the right is the Hudson River. And so they had to lower these barges through locks. And if you're not familiar with a lock, we'll talk a little bit about that. This is the terminus of the gravity railroad where it meets the canal in Honesdale, Pennsylvania. Now remember, the canal ran from 1828 to 1898, for 70 years. And so during that time, photography was developed. So we have photographs of the later period of the canal, not the early. And on this one, you'll see people on a car on the left, because the gravity railroad transported coal down to the docks in Honesdale, and it transported people up to the mountains where the coal fields were to go picnicking. This is another shot of the DNH Canal, and you can see the chutes on the left loading coal into these big barges. Now, the barges could carry, in the beginning, they carried between 30 and 40 tons of coal. And as the canal was expanded and deepened, the barges got larger. And at the end, in the 1880s and 90s, the barges could carry 130 tons of coal, or 140 ton. They were huge, and the canal was this is the Hudson River. The barges would follow the canal all the way to Roundout to Kingston, and then they would, in the beginning, they would load the canal, the coal onto river barges that would go down to New York City. Later, as the barges got larger, they would themselves make the trip down to New York City, and then they would sell the coal. And we're talking about millions of tons of coal in the 70 years. This is what supplied New York City. And when the barges were emptied in New York City, then you see these are pulling a row of barges back up to the canal to Kingston. Sometimes they would take dry goods, occasionally passengers, and supplies back up and into the interior, into Sullivan County and into Wayne County. So this was it was mostly a big business in one direction, moving coal and also moving some lumber. But in the other direction, it did move some dry goods. And for a while they tried passengers, but it wasn't profitable. This is a picture of Rosendale, and you can see the barge kind of off to one side. On the right is the towpath. In the back, you can see the little town of Rosendale. You see the telegraph or telephone wires. So you can tell kind of what era we're in. Now, I want to talk a little bit about these barges because the barges were privately owned. And they had to be licensed to go on this canal. So the company, the DNH Canal Company, owned the canal. And what they would do is they would loan money to someone to buy a barge. And you'd buy a barge, and you'd take as many trips as you could get in, and you'd pay off your purchase. And it might take you 10 years, it might take you 15 years. And about the time you paid off your barge, they had bigger, better, newer ones, and you'd buy another one and you'd work another 15 years and you'd pay that one off. Families lived on these barges, and they had little cabins. And if you go to the Roebling Bridge, there's a facsimile of one of the cabins in the little toll keeper's house that you can see today. These barges were usually pulled by mules, sometimes a horse and a mule, but horses were expensive, mules were cheaper. Horses did a better job, they could pull more, but people usually couldn't afford them. So they were usually pulled by sometimes a horse and a mule, but usually mules. And they were walked usually by a child. And the family that owned the barge, one of their boy or girl, would lead the mules on the tow path and pull the barge through the water. And if the family didn't have a child, they would go to an orphanage and they would get a child. And they tell the story that if a barge and a child slipped and fell into the water, if a mule and a child slipped and fell into the water off the towpath, that the barge owner would grab the mule first, because it cost money to replace a mule, but you could always get another child. And these were brutal times. Later, men were hired to lead the mules, and they became predominant over children. There was the development of the steam engine, but they found that steam engines were too fast, were too efficient, and you couldn't go fast on the canal. In fact, there was a speed limit, and because you would slosh water out, and the canal, the purpose, the prime directive of the canal was don't spill the water. And the canal not only built this canal, the locks, they built reservoirs, dry docks, basins, water chutes to continually pump water into this canal because it would leak out or it would get splashed out. This shows a barge coming across the aqueduct that was built across the Lackawaxen River. And you can see it's narrow right where the barge is crossing, so only one could cross at a time. It was very wide just before you got to the bridge to allow barges to park until somebody had passed. Now, the company was about making money, and they were also about scientific and technological advancement. And so from the time the canal was conceived until the time it died, they were making improvements. And the canal originally was 4 feet deep, and they deepened it to 6 feet. It was widened in areas. The locks, and if you understand what a lock is, it's like a little space where you take the barge and into a, like in this picture, and you would close a door in front of the barge, and then you would close these big gates behind the barge, and you would pump water in or out to raise the level. And then when the level was raised, you'd open the door, and the barge would be at a new level. Well, remember, over 1,000 feet in height had to be made up. So there were 108 locks. So they had to average about 10 feet change in height each one. And when they originally built the locks, it took 2 people to operate them. And so you had to pay the salaries of 216 men. They didn't use women at that time, but they had families and they would live in a lock keeper's house. So it didn't take long before some technology came by and they were able to adapt the canal so the locks could be operated by 1 man. And they fired half of their lock keepers. So this was all about cost. One of the things that made it difficult was the canal crossed the Delaware River. And you remember a couple of months ago, I talked about the raftsmen who were riding these huge wooden rafts down the river. And you can imagine they're putting these canal barges into the river, and the barges are going across in one direction and the rafts are coming down in the other direction, and there was conflict. They would run into each other, and some of the barges would get destroyed, and there were claims, and they were in court. So the company decided to hire somebody to build aqueducts, bridges that would cross the waterways. And this is the Roebling Aqueduct. And we're going to talk more about John Roebling in a little bit, but if you see the canal, so instead of having to lower the canal boats into the Delaware River and cross it and put them back in the canal, they just went across and over the river. And you can see the river underneath, and you can see the bridge or the aqueduct. And the development of this aqueduct was a technological advancement. And again, like changing the locks, like deepening the canal, this made it quicker. It took barges about 7 days to go from Honesdale to Kingston. And the canal operated from dawn to dusk, didn't operate in the dark, and it didn't operate on Sundays. So anything that could speed it up, and this sped up the canal and avoided the conflict with the rafts. This is a schematic of the Roebling Bridge. And you see the cable, which is the same kind of cable that's used in modern suspension bridges. If you've crossed the George Washington Bridge or the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, or the Bear Mountain Bridge, or any of them, you'll see a big cable, and that's what's holding the bridge works. And you can actually see this exists, this bridge, and you can walk across it now. You can drive across it. It doesn't carry water anymore, but it does carry cars. But you can see the barge. You see the woman is in the back operating the till. You can see it looks like a horse or two horses, or a horse and a mule up in the front, walking on the towpath, and there's somebody leading them. And this shows, this is another view of that same Roebling Bridge. And it was, you can see on the left, it looks like a horse and a mule, and it looks like a little boy. And then you can see the barge off to the right, and somebody's in the front, and you see the canal has water in it. It's and the barge is crossing the river. It's 40, 50 feet high above the river. When it gets to this side, then there's a series of locks that will lower the barge down, and it'll keep on its way. This is a view of the Roebling Bridge today. This is what it looks like. You see the stone piers. The wooden, it looks like boats sticking in the front, are icebreakers. Remember, the river is flowing downstream in the winter. It's filled with ice. It has ice in the river today. And when the ice begins to break up, they wanted to protect the bridge work. So these project out to break up the ice as it comes down, and they protect the stonework. In all the years since this bridge and canal has been in existence, which was 1848. So the canal was built in 1828. It operated for 20 years, and then they hired John Roebling to design and to build this bridge, this aqueduct. It was built in 1848, and it operated until 1898 for 50 years. as a canal, as an aqueduct, carried millions of tons of coal, all of which went down to New York City. Now, I want to talk a little bit about John Roebling, the serious-looking dude. If you see some of his letters, he used to sign his letters to his wife, your husband, Mr. John A. Roebling. So it wasn't, I love you, Johnny. It was Mr. John Roebling. He was Bavarian. He settled in the United States. He studied engineering in Germany, and he lived down in the Trenton area of New Jersey. And what he did was he developed a series of wire cable and Roebling's wire rope. And he developed a way to take this wire cable and to spin it to actually create it on site. And this allowed him to build structures. Now, the wire rope that he developed was so strong that when the National Park Service purchased the Roebling Bridge, they hired engineers and they came in and they actually cracked open the cable and took a little piece, one of the strands of iron out of it, and had it tested for its tensile strength. And it was as strong today as it was when it had been put in 1848. So the only deterioration was where at the tops of the where you can see the cable under the light posts here, there's some pressure because it's compacted, it's holding up all that weight. So that was slightly deteriorated, and the birds would get into there, and the bird guana would deteriorate the outer wrapping of the cable. But the cable is strong, capable. It held more weight when it was filled with water, carrying 140-ton barges, than it does today with an occasional car or truck. I think there's a 15-ton limit on driving across it, which is funny because the barges weighed 140 tons. But John Roebling went on to do some other things, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But his wire rope was also used by Otis for elevators. And if you think about the development of the American city, it's suspension bridges that allowed you access in and out of these cities. Most great cities are built on rivers because for all kinds of reasons, the water, the sanitation, the transportation, it's just, most cities are built on rivers. But how do you cross the rivers? You need bridges. Well, suspension bridges allow you to cross greater distances. So his invention of spinning wire cable allowed the construction of larger and larger suspension bridges. And in fact, Roebling built bridges all over the United States, in Cincinnati, in Kentucky, in New York City. And his company went on to supply the wire cable for the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. But his most famous work, he didn't build. And this is on the top is the Brooklyn Bridge. And he designed it. And I wanted to show the contrast of these two, because if you look at his signature, which is the slope of the wire, and you see how the wire slopes from the towers. And then if you look down at this is the Roebling Aqueduct, and if you see the slope of the wire, the scale is different, but the concept is the same. Now, if you know a little bit about the Brooklyn Bridge, it's a marvel. It was built in the 1870s. It was John Roebling designed it. And before construction started, he injured his foot, and he died 3 or 4 weeks later from an infection. And his son Washington Roebling took over construction. And Washington was developing, they were digging the caissons, the pits to put the towers, and his son developed the bends because the pressure down below was too great and he came up too soon. And so he was incapacitated and ended up that his wife, Emily Roebling, ended up actually being the manager that constructed the bridge. And there's a great book by McCullough. There's several books and stories told about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. They're wonderful stories. The fact that it was constructed by a woman who didn't have formal training in engineering or in construction, I think just shows we've got a lot to learn about our history. But all of this was developed by this man, John Roebling. Now, so I want to just go back a little bit to my original premise in talking about the industrial development of our country. And this was wilderness. It still is wilderness where we live now. 10 Mile River that's what we love about it, is its wilderness. The river valley is a wild and scenic river. But at one time, it was the center of industrialization. It was the canal that linked the energy source in Pennsylvania with New York City. And it was the innovation, the design of these businessmen who created this amazing canal and then hired a wire rope manufacturer, engineer to design an aqueduct. And he developed the techniques that enabled modern suspension bridges to be built. All from this little area here, pretty amazing. So the impact of this canal, and I've just scratched the surface on the details and the history of it. But Philip Hone, after whom Honesdale is named, was the mayor of New York City. So there's no accident. He was involved in the development of the canal, and they named Honesdale after him. John Jervis was the engineer, the assistant engineer originally, and then the engineer for this amazing system, and they named Port Jervis after him. And if you think about, Port Newark or Port Orange, or when you think about ports, you don't think about a place like Port Jervis, but it was a port. And there were, hundreds of barges that traveled through it every week. Phillipsport is another, it's a little place, if you've been on Route 209 in Sullivan County, almost into Ulster County. And Phillipsport, it's not a port, you can barely see any water there, but it was on the canal. Summitville was the highest point of the canal, of the eastern part of the canal. Once you came down from Honesdale, and you got to where the Delaware River was, you had to go up again to get over that portion of the, before you could go down to the Hudson River. So Summitville was the highest point of the eastern part of the canal. Benjamin Wright was the man that was the engineer for the Erie Canal, and he came in and was the original designer of this canal. Maurice Wirtz, William Wirtz, and the other brother was Charles Wirtz, were the developers of the canal. And of course, Wirtzboro is named after them. But I want to say, they didn't care about the canal. Not that they didn't care about it, but it wasn't, they were businessmen interested in making money. And canals were they were a wonderful way to move product until railroads came along. And railroads can operate all year. Canals can only operate in the warm weather, because when it gets to freezing, the canal freezes. So the canal shut down for several months every year. In a terrible drought, there's not enough water, and then the canal has to shut down in a drought year. The canals also are dirty, and these are the water doesn't flow in a canal. You pull a barge through it. So people are emptying their chamber pots into the canal, and animals are defecating on the towpath into the canal. And so there were several outbreaks of disease along canals. So you can see the advantage of a railroad. It operates all year round. You don't have the illness. It's not as expensive to make, to lay some track down as it is to dig a tunnel, essentially. So the Wirtz brothers, around about the 1870s, began to see that railroads were going to outstrip canals. So they stopped innovating and developing the canal, and they began to develop a railroad. And the DNH Canal Company became the DNH Railroad. And they never lost money. They eventually abandoned the canal and were in the railroad business. And then they used the railroad to transport their coal. So it was a means to an end, an amazing means. And I want to talk a little bit about remembering this canal. We have a local historic organization called the Delaware Company, and they have a project called the Cape Project, where this is a picture of the Delaware River. You can see the little village you see there is Minisink Ford on the left, and that's the towpath. And you see they're going to place some historic markers and some benches, and they're going to place a little statue of Katie and a mule along the towpath, which would be a walking trail, and it'll go from the Barbary Game and Eagle overlook all the way to the Roebling Bridge. And it will remember again that it was children who often led the animals that towed the barges. There have been studies done on the education of canal children, actually, because you think about it, you couldn't put them in school. Often the parents were not educated themselves, so they weren't getting a homeschooling education. So there actually have been studies done as to what happened to these kids. We're talking about hundreds, maybe thousands of children over a 70-year period. All right, there were hundreds of barges. Each one needed somebody to lead it. And these kids were walking 10, 15 miles a day, right? If you went 108 miles in a week, you can figure it out. You're walking at least 15 miles a day in order to do that. So this was a long, grueling day. You're walking 15 miles. It's not uphill. It's not downhill largely. You're just walking level. But you're leading the mule. So the effect of the canal on this area was amazing. Barryville was a bustling town. When Sullivan County was organized and a county seat was to be named, there were three contenders. There was Liberty, there was Monticello, and there was Barryville. When the railroad, and you can see on this picture on the right, all the extreme right is the railroad that comes through. That was the Erie Long Line Railroad. That also changed this area, kept it industrial. Port Jervis was a union town, and many of the streets and names, I went through some of the names of the towns that were related to the canal. There's a canal street in Port Jervis and other places. There's a towpath roads. There was many effects of this, and you can still see the archaeological remnants of this canal. Amazing development. Most people never give it another thought. But if you've driven around or paid attention, every place you go between Minisink Ford and Port Jervis along the river, you'll see remnants of the canal. If you want to know more about this, there's a great book called Coal Boats to Tidewater. Manville Wakefield is the author. He wrote a couple of books. This is one version of the book. If you look online on Amazon or any place, you'll see there are many different covers to it. It's essentially the same book. I think it was updated at one point, but they tell the story. A lot of the folklore involved in it. They talk a lot about the Gravity Railroad, and just a truly amazing story about our wilderness area, about the industrial development in our wilderness area. So with that said, I'd be happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Glenn. This was terrific. Hi, I'm Mitchell, and I'm the vice chair of the TMR Museum and a longtime summer camper at our camp. And great presentation and appreciate it. And we do have a few questions. So why don't we just pull them on up and jump into things? Okay, so I know you mentioned a little bit about the Brooklyn Bridge during your presentation. And what did Roebling know when he was building the canal? Did he know he was going to go on to build the Brooklyn Bridge, or what did he know, or future things?
This was the Roebling Aqueduct was not his first bridge construction. So he had done others, and I don't know if he knew he was going to go on to do the Brooklyn Bridge, but he went on to develop a number of them. Cincinnati has one that's I believe still standing, and there are others. If you Google John Roebling, you'll see a list of all of his works. The Civil War slowed down some bridge construction, so that there was a period of time when he wasn't making bridges because the country was at war. But he again primarily was a wire rope manufacturer. So when he wasn't building bridges, he was making wire rope for other purposes. I think his success. I don't know what he knew, but when they tell the story when he built the Roebling Aqueduct, and it was done, and the local people came to look at it, and they thought, "Oh my God, when you take one of those barges across that aqueduct, it'll fall down, right? It can't possibly hold that weight." So people held their breath when the first barge went across the Roebling Bridge. Well, in reality, if you know physics, you know that the barge displaced its weight in water. So there was no increased weight on the bridge, right? The barge went across the bridge, across the aqueduct, and displaced water equal to its weight. So there was no increased weight. It was whatever the weight was when it started. So he knew things like that. All right. So he knew the bridge. He knew it wasn't going to fall down. Other people didn't. I don't think he knew that he was going to build the Brooklyn Bridge, but he knew he was going to go on to build other bridges.
Fantastic. And that was actually part of the next question about the barge and water displacement. So great. So we'll jump over to, what did New York City use before coal?
They used coal. I mean, it depends on how far back you want to go, but they got their coal from England. England was a great producer of coal, Great Britain, and they shipped it all over the world. And just like tea, they didn't like it if it came from anybody else. So they damped down on the colonials developing their own coal. Well, when the War of 1812 comes along, there's no coal in New York City because Britain's not shipping it there. There may have been some local little coal fields. I don't know enough about the lower mid Hudson or Long Island to know if there's any coal, but they didn't have access. I'm sure there was always some. There's always some that gets in, but they didn't have a steady, strong supply of coal that you could use for heating homes, for industry, for shipbuilding, for all the things that you wanted to do in the city. You needed a steady supply of coal. And the Wirtz brothers saw that, knew that, and they were the guys that met the need.
Great. Is the railroad that was built to replace the canal the same one we have today?
Well, it doesn't operate anymore. The same one is too general. The one that lives across along the river was the Erie Railroad, and that was Jay Gould and a whole different robber baron who developed the Erie Long Line to connect New York City with Chicago. The DNH was built and operated up in Sullivan County, came through the center of Sullivan County, came up through Wirtsboro. There's still a tunnel in Wirtsboro, and all of the rails to trails that go through Mountaindale and Liberty and Parksville. That's the old DNH Railroad. It doesn't operate anymore today, but it's not the same as the Erie Railroad. There were many railroads back in the day. They competed with each other. And the interesting thing is the DNH never lost any money. It went in the transition from being a canal company to a railroad company. They just kept making profit. In the 1960s, railroads went out of business. And there used to be passenger service up into the 60s that came up into Mountaindale and Hurleyville and Liberty. And along the river, there was the Erie Railroad that came up, and there were, you stood the train stations in Callicoon and in Narrowsburg, but the passenger service went out. The DNH Railroad was not the Erie Railroad, but it existed up until the 1960s.
Great. A couple of questions on Roebling and his engineering background. What was the engineering background on wire in this usage? And then did Roebling build some of the other bridges in the upper Delaware? And those are some of the questions that are sort of tied in. Oh, and then here, when did the NPS purchase the bridge? And where was the aqueduct over the Lackawaxen that you put in the presentation?
All right. So Roebling was hired by the DNH Canal Company to build 4 aqueducts. And the largest and the only one that remains is the Roebling Aqueduct that connects Lackawaxen with Minisink Ford. That's the only bridge he built over the Delaware. There were some other fine bridge builders, and the second oldest bridge that still exists is the one at Skinner's Falls, and that was built by the same people the same company that ended up building the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. But that's a beautiful old structure, but it's a truss bridge. It's not a suspension bridge. The other aqueducts that Roebling built, one was over the Lackawaxen, and you can see the remnants, the piers of it. If you go hiking, you go to Lackawaxen, you go walking along the river, you'll unmistakably find the piers. It doesn't exist anymore as a bridge. The other one was across at Cutterbackville, across the Neversink, and it doesn't exist anymore either. And then the other was over at High Falls, over by Kingston, and of course that one doesn't exist either. But so he crossed the 4 waterways that enabled the canals, the canal barges, to not be lowered into the waterway and dragged across and brought back. That was the only, remember, he didn't build the bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge. He designed it. But he did do bridges all across the country. And again, I don't remember, I know the one in Cincinnati, but I don't remember all the rest. His background, he studied engineering in Germany, and he and his brothers came to America as part of a group to form a kind of utopian community. And they had a falling out, and so they never built this utopian community back in the early 1800s. But he started this wire cable business. I don't know why. It's an interesting question, but I know he was trained as an engineer. He developed this very successful wire rope business and was able to parlay it into many, many uses.
Great. We have a couple of other questions, and then we'll turn it back to Anthony to do a wrap up, but we have a little bit of time. So here's an interesting question. I'm 63. When I was a kid, I remember an old man collecting tolls at the end of the Roebling Bridge. Do you recall this? Apparently it was privately owned.
Yes, I do remember. There still exists a toll bridge on the Delaware. There's several of them down in New Jersey, but a privately owned one down at Dingman's. But when the Roebling Bridge, when the canal was abandoned, pieces of it were sold. And a large part was bought by a man who wanted to create a reservoir system to move water. And that didn't work. But a man that was a lumberman bought the Roebling Aqueduct, drained it, and used it to transport his lumber back and forth across the river. And since he did that, he had a little cabin, a little house built at one end. It was a toll keeper's house, and it's still there. It was so he charged everybody else. So his workers moved the lumber back and forth, and he collected a toll. And that was in the the canal ended in 1898. So in 1900-ish, it was sold to the lumberman. And from then on until the 1970s, it was a toll bridge, privately owned, and by somebody that bought the bridge, and somebody lived in a little house, and you drive by and they collect the money. And when the Park Service bought it, they of course, didn't charge tolls anymore, but they wanted to rip down the toll house because it wasn't historically accurate. Because the important piece was the bridge, was the aqueduct, and the National Park Service to this day won't call it the Roebling Bridge. They call it Roebling's Delaware Aqueduct, because historically that's what it was, and they don't want to mislead anybody. But
great. Couple more questions.
Well, let me just finish here, because
sorry.
When the Park Service wanted to take down the house, local people in the town of Highland said, "Wait a minute, you want to get rid of our history?" And the Park Service said, "No, that's the toll isn't part of the history." And people said, "Yes, that aqueduct existed for 50 years, from 1848 to 1898. But the toll house existed for 75 years, from 1900 to 1975. So it's existed longer than the aqueduct did. So you want to take down our history." So they wouldn't let the Park Service tear down the toll house, and to this day it exists. And the Park Service doesn't want it to, but they use it for interpretive purposes. I'm sorry.
No problem. I'm sorry for that. I thought you had finished when you were talking about misleading us, which you would never do. So How old were the children that we used to pull the mules?
I don't know the age, but they had to be at least 8 or 9, I would think. Uh, and I think by the time they got to be teenagers, they were off. You're going to hang around, especially if you were an orphan that got adopted to do essentially slave labor. I can't imagine you'd hang around. So they weren't old. They were probably 8, 9 to 12, 13. But as I said, later on, they started to be replaced by the men who did it, probably because they weren't that reliable. But you
Very
can
interesting.
study that anyway.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's kind of like, I guess, maybe think about labor laws today now. But yeah, very interesting. Here's another interesting question. Wasn't the first locomotive in the U.S. part of the Gravity Railroad, and is there a copy in Honesdale?
I'm sorry, was the what? The first
Wasn't
part
the
of
first locomotive in the U.S. part of the Gravity Railroad, and is there a copy in Honesdale?
Yes, there is the Sturbridge Lion, and there's so many great details. Remember, these guys, they were about technology and efficiency. And so when a steam locomotive came along, they bought one from England. They imported it, and they decided they would use that because that would be more efficient than just using gravity and chains and wire cable and hooking up cars and filling this one and that one. So they purchased a locomotive, but when they went to use it, it was too heavy for the tracks that they had. So it was never actually used for the Gravity Railroad. But you're right, it was purchased for that, and there is a replica of it in Honesdale today that you can go see, and they tell the story of the Sturbridge Lion.
Terrific. And I think we'll go with the last 2 questions, then we'll throw it back to Anthony. A lot of thank yous, and I'm thanking you. And okay. How did the gravity rail car get back to the top?
Okay, so think about this. You've got two cars, right? And you got a hill. And this one goes up to the top. And this one's at the bottom. And you fill this one with coal and gravity, and they're connected by a chain. So when this one goes down, because it's filled with coal, and this one's empty, it goes up to the top. You empty the one that you filled. Now you fill this one up here, and gravity works its way and pulls that one down. So they were connected by a cable or a chain, and they used rope, and then they tried to chain, and then they hired Roebling's. They got Roebling's wire cable, and that's what made it work. So you fill the one at the top with coal, and gravity pulls it to the bottom, and the empty one goes up to the top, and then you fill that one, and it goes back and forth like that. It's ingenious.
Great. And are there any intact locks that we could see today? And if there are, where would we see them?
Well, there are no functioning locks, okay? But there are locks that you can go in and see. And the first place I would go is there's 2 museums to the DNH Canal. One is at High Falls over by Kingston, and the other one is at Cutterbackville on Route 209. So that one's closer. They have a replica of a barge that they've built. They have sections of the canal. Some of it has water in it. There's also a 3 or 4 acre Sullivan County park that has a canal in it at Summitville. So there's 3 really good locations. But if you're not up to traveling to Cutterbackville or to Summitville or to High Falls, if you go to the Roebling Bridge and you walk the towpath, and you look around, you can see where there is an old lock. It's not operating. There's trees grow. Remember, it stopped almost 100 years ago. So there's trees, big trees growing up in the middle of it and all, but you can make out a lot. But those other three places have, you can really go see them.
Perfect. And on that note, thank you very much. If anybody has any questions that we didn't answer tonight, feel free to email us through the GoToWebinar app, and we're happy to email you answers back. And just in case anybody wants to know a little bit more, I know there were a bunch of questions about John Roebling and his background. David McCullough wrote a brilliant book about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, which talks a lot about Roebling. And I forgot the name of the book, but I think it's something like Brooklyn Bridge or something, or the creation of the Brooklyn Bridge. But you could Google it; it'll come up on Amazon or wherever. And back to Anthony. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, and see you all next month. We're going to talk a little bit about the Battle of Minisink, and I enjoyed this, and hope everyone is well.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. The TMR Scout Museum would like to thank Glenn Pontier for tonight's fun talk. We hope you have enjoyed it and that you will join us again for future talks. In the next few days, you will receive an email with copies of tonight's presentation and a link to the recording of tonight's presentation. And a copy of the recording will also be on YouTube. Now, Glenn will be back with us, as he just mentioned, on Thursday, March 11th, for our next program. His topic will be the Battle of Minisink. We hope you plan on joining us. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night.